We are all good. Other than Scott and I getting into our discussion beforehand that delayed us, which is very much going to tie into our topic. Did you want to mention, before we dive into that topic, did you want to mention your HashiCorp news that you posted out there? I saw that link.
Yeah.
This was
so
interesting-ish.
I spend a little bit of my life thinking about how we interact with our customers with open source tooling, right? Like I've got AZ Copy and SDKs and all these things, and we certainly want to encourage customer contributions. I work with customers to help them, sometimes like think about ways to do like data migration and maybe wrap AZ Copy rather than building your own data migration engine, things like that. So, all our stuff is like out on GitHub with a fairly standard MIT license.
Yep.
Like, another customer could come and they could fork one of our projects, take it on, and pick it up and make it their own thing, and they could support it and do whatever they need to from there. So HashiCorp, they are so they're the purveyors of Terraform. So Terraform has traditionally been an open source project, and it's been, I believe it was licensed under an MIT license previously. But regardless of that, they've been in a position where they publish things like the core of the Terraform engine out to GitHub, and anybody can come and clone or fork that project and do what they need to do with it. So that could be a customer, it could be an ISV, it could be a partner, could frankly be a competitor. And then HashiCorp, like many other companies that publishes open source tooling, they have an enterprise entity as well, and that entity is out there to make money and keep the rest of the business going. So HashiCorp made the decision this week, yesterday. Today is Friday, August 10th, 2023. As of August 10th, 2023, they are going to a BSL or a BUSL, but it's a business source license. So it's an alternative license that puts some restrictions in place, particularly in the areas of what competitors can do with that code and where they might need to acquire a commercial license from HashiCorp. But if you're like a big open source purist, I can't say I'm like exactly evangelical about it. But for all the FAQs and everything that HashiCorp put out and blog posts and things like that, like this effectively makes them not open source in like the true, evangelical kind of sense of things. I don't think there's a major impact to customers. There should not be a major impact to customers. Like everything stays up on GitHub. You still have access to SDKs, APIs. Where it starts to get interesting is in how those restrictive covenants potentially impact others from working with HashiCorp. So now it becomes really a HashiCorp decision for who they choose to really dive in and work with and grant additional licensing to beyond their BSL licensing. So if you think about being a hyperscaler, right, you're Microsoft with Azure, your AWS, Amazon with AWS, your Google with GCP, all those kinds of things. There are pretty decent hooks in Terraform. And we've talked about this a little bit in the past for like working with these hyperscalers and having ready to go providers in Terraform for all the major clouds, all the major resources, things like that. So technically at this point, per that BSL, depending on how like HashiCorp kind of chooses to look at it. Like if they didn't already have a relationship with Microsoft and Amazon and others, that could be kind of bad. Like they're saying they're going to continue to work with all these companies. Clearly, they made this decision for a reason. Like they must have some competitors who are leaning in like way too hard, and they feel like they're using their IP that had been previously released under that earlier. It wasn't an MIT model. It was an MPL, Mozilla Public License. So under that model that was out there before, it's going to be interesting maybe to see like over the next year, 6 months to a year, like who has to drop out and can't stay in the race because of that. There's been a lot of this lately. Like HashiCorp isn't the only company to do this. I don't know if you follow along with Linux distributions and things that are going on there. Red Hat had kind of a big brouhaha around what they've done with their enterprise licensing and how that formulates and comes back to things like CentOS and what was going to get out into mainline. It's kind of like Java did or Oracle did with Java a couple of years ago, however long ago that was now, and took all those things down that path. So we shall see where all this stuff goes. I think it's a weird time in open source land. Like if you're an open source purist, as a lot of these entities that have open source components that then they've commercialized maybe a little bit more than support on top of, and they're truly product driven. Like they're trying to peel their products back and own more of that and own more of their future along the way.
Yeah, I read this and I couldn't figure out exactly, to your point, this doesn't change a lot. And I've used some of their stuff a little bit. And the one one sentence they have in here, about halfway down, it's towards the bottom of the article, there's comments and stuff, is that it really impacts, like you said, the vendors who provide competitive services built on their community products and their ability to incorporate future releases, bug fixes, security patches, all of that. I didn't even think, like, would this really affect Microsoft? Because does Microsoft actually build competitive services built on their community products?
HashiCorp owns the underlying engine. I don't know how it is at AWS and GCP. But in the case of Microsoft, direct contributor to the resource provider in Terraform for ARM resources. So and there's some there's some logic behind that, right? If you think about companies like HashiCorp with Terraform or Puppet and Chef and some of these other orchestration engines, they don't necessarily always know like what's coming next, right? Like, hey, when's that next new feature going to come in that service, or there's a new service lighting up. So sometimes, like at least in the case of the hyperscalers, like we're more well positioned to own that stuff and kind of push out updates downstream. And to do that, it's got to be a back and forth relationship, right? Like we need to know what's coming in Terraform, and folks at HashiCorp need to know what's coming on our side. So that needs to be a little bit of a dialogue, because like Terraform for Azure used to move a lot slower until kind of Microsoft stepped in and took on some of that dev effort up front to get those things moving. So I don't know, like if HashiCorp came back and they said, we want to build all of our own providers now, and those are core to the Terraform experience, like for the hyperscalers, like what does that mean for the hyperscalers, right? Like I don't think it would get there, but the kind of meta point is HashiCorp is in full control of that now. So back to that whole like, what's open source thing, and you know, is somebody going to be like a little bit more evangelical or a purist about it? It's a little bit of a different place to be, right? When the enterprise steps back in and takes that on for themselves.
Got it. Interesting.
Yeah. So I thought it was a fun one. And like I said, like no major impact to customers, I don't think, unless you're using a competitor product that somehow runs afoul of this thing. And that's when it becomes interesting in like 6 to 12 months, because, as new features come out on the HashiCorp side, or in the core of Terraform, like, can they keep up with it? Like, I don't know. We shall see. But if you're just a regular customer and you're out there and like, hey, I use Terraform and I deploy it and I use these things, like, you're fine, right? No major impact for you there.
Right.
If you wanted to go out and build a competitor business, though, you're like, ooh, I just became a Terraform expert. And now I want to build a competitive business on top of it. Like, depending on what you want to build, that could be rougher.
Right, because that's what I'm going to say. As long as it sounds like you're not actually building anything that competes with Terraform, you're still not, there still isn't any impact for you. It's only if you use their stuff to build other stuff that competes with their stuff.
Yes. Yep. Yeah, that's my reading of their BSL and kind of reading between the lines in their FAQ. But, folks got to go out and read that for themselves and take it in. And I am not a lawyer. Yeah.
Or a licensing expert. So, yes, I agree. Go figure it out. Have your lawyers figure it out if you think it might impact you. But to your point, if you're out there just building stuff, deploying stuff, managing state with Terraform and all that, really nothing changes. So
correct. All right. So since we've been talking about Terraform and deploying stuff, you want to talk about deploying stuff?
Let's talk about deploying stuff. So I had a client come to me and they said, we want to deploy, and this for anybody listening or those of you in the Discord anxiously waiting, this is the discussion Scott and I were having right before we jumped on live today. I had a customer come to me and they said, I want to deploy Microsoft Defender for Cloud, but I'm not going to give you access to the subscription. I will only give you access to the 3 resource groups that we want to push Microsoft Defender for Cloud to, and we don't necessarily want to turn it on for everything. We are a small business segment focused on a particular app that it's 3 resource groups, same subscription, dev, test, QA. Frankly, I don't even know what other resource groups are in there or how many they have, what other resources they have. And I was like, okay, let's go turn this on, light it up for the VMs. And I knew I was going to have to go into the subscription. You turn on Microsoft Defender for Cloud at the subscription. I don't know that I ever put 2 and 2 together until I went to try to do this, that you cannot only light this up for a subset of resources, whether they be on a resource by resource basis ish. There are some exceptions to this, but just a couple, or even at a resource group level. Like all of the Defender for Cloud is published with pricing of like servers, $15 per server per month for Defender for Cloud Plan 2, so much for Azure SQL, so much for storage accounts, all of this. But you go turn this on at your subscription and you can pick and choose which resources you want on. So you could only turn it on for servers or only turn it on for storage accounts.
Pick which resource types.
Which resource types, yes.
Yeah.
Good, yes. Clarify that. Resource types. Only turn it on for SQL. But it will get turned on for all of that particular resource type at the entire subscription level. So in this case, this small business segment, because they just did resource groups in a much larger subscription that realistically could have 300 other resource groups in it, for all I know, cannot leverage Microsoft Defender for Cloud without impacting the other 297 or 506 or whatever number it happens to be, without impacting and conversely paying for that resource type protection across the entire subscription. And I was complaining about that because I wanted to have more granularity in which resources this gets deployed to. I said there are some exceptions. There's a couple of them. Like I noticed storage accounts. You can go into a storage account, go into Defender for Cloud, and essentially say, don't inherit the settings from the subscription and just disable Defender for Cloud on the storage account. But that does not hold true for every resource. nor is there any way to do that with like policy or exclusions of a certain resource group. It's like a manual resource by resource toggle that you could probably script it out, but I was annoyed. And I was complaining
love
to Scott.
As a good lesson in potentially how you approach deploying a new service in the cloud. So it sounds like, and it's kind of an unfortunate situation, but it sounds like that customer that you're working with didn't take step one, which was go read the pricing docs. Like that is the most important piece of documentation that you could sit down and kind of start to consume and touch. And I don't know that the Defender team has done a great job with kind of disambiguating what is an individual resource constraint within their service, and then what's just the broader Defender for a cloud thing. So step one would be, hey, let's go read the pricing docs. Step two, and we kind of do this on all the, the cloud streams we do, right? Like when we want to start playing with this stuff is, hey, let's go read the overview docs. I've never touched this service before. Let's just see what's going on with it. What are you kicking around? So, you and I were chatting earlier about it. So I started going down that path. I'm like, all right, let me go look at the pricing docs. Let me see what's happening. Let me go look at the overview. And if you go look at the overview for Defender, it very quickly points you to a place which says, how do you enable paid plans on your subscriptions? And I absolutely love the way this is done. If you go to that link that I just put in Discord, it'll be in the show notes there. That is it has a note, like one of those like purple boxes in the Microsoft Docs. And that is the one place where I have found so far that it calls out, here is the specific set of resource types that are going to be available for individual like resource level enablement. Like you mentioned storage accounts, there's Defender for SQL, which you got to be careful with because there's Defender for SQL, like Defender for like SQL services, like Azure SQL. Yep. And then there's Defender for SQL, like IaaS VMs. So that one's a little bit weird. You have open source relational databases. So like MySQL, MariaDB, things like that. And then you can also do workspace level Defender plans for servers and Defender for SQL servers on virtual machines. That being said, Defender is like a slew of things. I forget how many they have. There's got to be at least 10 different workload types that they cover, if not more within there today, and they keep adding more of them on. So the way I like to think about Defender in the back of my head is Defender is fundamentally a subscription scoped thing, right? Like I'm going to light this up and it's going to protect everything in my subscription for a workload that I enable. So I go enable, Defender for servers. Great. Or let's pick one that it can only cover everything. So I go to Defender for app service. Every single app service, regardless of scope within that subscription, like if it lives, in this resource group over here, this resource group, like all of them are just now protected, versus that Defender for storage thing, which then I go light it up one piece at a time and turn it on that way. The other thing that I've seen that's very
storage accounts, it's the opposite way. You go turn it on and it lights it up for everything. It's on by default for everything. You have to go disable it.
Yes.
Yes, it's not you can light it up and then go enable it one by one. It's you light it up and then you have to go through. So in my case, like let's say they have 300 subscriptions, I'd have to go into the other 297 subscriptions and turn off every storage account across all those subscriptions after I enabled it. I can't just enable it and then say, let's go manually turn it on these two or three.
You want me to give you like another little bit of nuance here that's probably going to annoy you even more?
Sure.
You don't enable Defender for cloud for resources like that in the actual resource provider of the owning service. So like for a storage account, if you want to manipulate Defender for Cloud for storage accounts, you use the Defender for Cloud RP, their resource provider, to do that, which makes sense, right? Because it's a Defender piece of functionality. But I have seen like customer asks come in where they go, hey, you don't have a commandlet in storage, or I can't do this through your API. And it's like, well, because it's not us that did it, right? It's the Defender team that did it. They own it. We give you the storage account, and now you wanted to do something else with an additive service that was technically outside of storage. Like, all right, you've got to go potentially solve for that one and figure it out. So Defender becomes kind of a wonky service in that way, because it's really like a big bundle, and then a bunch of attributes that are applied to it for workloads, and then you can potentially get really granular and go down to the resource level. But that's all dependent upon the Defender resource provider and their billing model and all the things that they do there. But I think another interesting thing that came out of the conversation we were having was I'm starting to talk to more and more customers where there's this inherent just fear of additional operational complexity around having multiple subscriptions in Azure. And I totally get it. Like if you've been doing Azure since the ASM days, or I'll say pre-management groups in Azure AD, Entra ID, all that stuff. Like if that's the mindset you're coming from and you've never played with management groups, then I think multi-subscription gets a little bit scary. Like it's tough. How do you have insights into things? How do you deploy policy at scale? All that good kind of stuff. The other thing that I run into is customers get scared of multiple subscriptions because they think multiple subscriptions means a bunch of manual process. Like, I'm a customer on an MCA. Like I transitioned from an EA, an enterprise agreement, over to a Microsoft customer agreement. And because I made that transition, now I'm just like, I'm on some kind of different plan. I don't know what I'm doing over here. If I want to create a new subscription, I'm going to go out to my licensing portal and spin it up that way. The portal that I still remember and is near and dear to my heart is the EA portal. Like I gone in there many a time and manually created a subscription. But you don't need to do that. Like there are avenues to programmatically create Azure subscriptions, and it's not for everybody. And when I say it's not for everybody, it's only available to certain classes of subscriptions or certain types. So specifically EA, MCA, and MPA subscriptions. But totally doable, right? Like, and then once you go down that path, like, so if I can programmatically create a subscription and I can manage all of my subscriptions at scale through management groups, at least in the lens of policy and getting that down, like that's kind of two big buckets for me. And then I think the third leg of that chair tends to be security. So I also see customers that still don't necessarily grok the whole Azure AD, Entra ID isn't actually Azure thing. Like it's kind of like this meta service sitting out over here. So they go, oh, I have to create another subscription. Well, that means I need to redo all my security and I'm going to have another identity provider. And I got to go back and I got to do my security groups. Like, no. Let's take a step back, because now you have a tenant that holds your identity. You're going to take that new subscription and associate it with that existing tenant. So it gets all the existing security. You can use the same security groups, same enterprise apps, same SPNs, all that kind of stuff is available to you. Management groups are going to be the construct that lets you come back and apply policy consistently across one or more subscriptions that you've grouped together. And you can have, I forget how many levels to the hierarchy or management groups. There's like 8 or 9 levels, something like that.
I can't remember.
There's a ton of flexibility there that's available to you, but you need to shift your mindset a little bit out of like, oh, I'm doing everything manually, over to how do I automate that and start to move things forward a little bit.
So here you go.
And then if
you can have 10,000 management groups in a single AD tenant and 6 levels of depth, not including the root or the subscription. So you've got levels and lots you can create.
Yeah. And then I think the other thing to think about here is, and we got a couple of folks mentioned it in the chat, is if you're an SMB, like you're just a small business, really, like, I get that there's friction, but how much friction is it for you to go to the Azure portal and just spin up a new subscription? Like next your way through it. Even if you're a PayGo customer, then you have to put a credit card on there. Like, heck, I do this as a PayGo customer. Like, I have to keep some Azure subscriptions around as just PayGo subscriptions because like there's only certain ways to get into functionality that I need, or I need visibility in the way customers see things versus the way they are in like our preview portals and stuff internally. And I just need them in like a bog standard subscription. So it's easy enough to do.
Yeah.
I think for a lot of it, and it's gonna sound harsh, and I know it's gonna sound harsh, but I don't mean it to be harsh. It's not as hard or as much friction as a lot of folks are thinking about it to be. Like once you sit down and think about it, like it does not take more than 5 minutes to create a new subscription if you just want to next your way through it. It's not like a 3-month project to figure it out and get it going. And start living your life that way.
Yeah, and even as a CSP, so I do indirect CSP stuff, and I have some clients that buy Azure subscriptions from me, and even from my side, same thing. They need a new subscription. It's like, sure, let me set one up for you. It takes me 30 seconds to go log into the portal, click new subscription. They're good to go. And I agree, like there was those questions in the Discord chat of like, someone asked typical number of subscriptions in a small business. Some people are saying at least 2. I think like at least to your point and mine, some of it is because of my Azure credits, but I have like 12 Azure subscriptions, and there's me and Sean and I have JP doing it. Like there's 3 or 4 of us. But it allows me to separate stuff out. Like I can go flip on Microsoft Defender for Cloud to see it and make sure I'm only hitting like one of each resource type. So I'm not using a bunch of money to test it. To your point, I think people way under create the number of subscriptions they realistically should. And I don't know that people put a lot of thought into it. Again, I'm going through this with another client right now where they have 5 or 6 subscriptions. We're going out to 11. We may even spin it out to even more for reasons like this. Like there's a lot of stuff at the subscription level. I think the other barrier I do see people run into is subscriptions. And it's something to think about is how do you do your networking if you're going to start spanning a bunch of subscriptions, because you do run into that a VNet, a network cannot span multiple subscriptions. So you end up having to do different things to connect these together. One could also argue it's good because it helps you separate out your networks and create maybe a true hub and spoke type model, separate out those networks, because maybe you shouldn't actually have all those resources in the same network anyways.
It's trade-offs and kind of rationalizing your way through it. So I'll go back to the docs thing again here. So Microsoft has a couple of frameworks. So there's the well-architected framework, like when you're actually getting ready to like build things out, like, hey, what's the best way for me to build this application or design it with services, things like that. There's another framework that's called the Cloud Adoption Framework. And inside of the Cloud Adoption Framework, there's tons of guidance around things like how should you think about organizing management groups? And I'm specifically going to say management groups, not management group, because it's you're probably going to have like multiple levels to that hierarchy and multiple groups within them. If you go out into the CAF, that Cloud Adoption Framework, And you start going into the resource organization stuff. Like you just threw a link in the chat for like organizing subscriptions. Just pay attention. Like everything is pluralized. Like it's not organized subscription, it's organized subscriptions. And even to the point where you get down and you like there's some use cases, like, hey, specific use cases. All the documentation is not create your initial subscription, it's create your initial subscriptions, scale with multiple subscriptions, organize your subscriptions. So the thing that folks need to get out of their head or potentially kind of just wrap their head around is if you've been doing Azure for a long time, you were taught to treat your subscription and then your resource groups inside that subscription as units of management that are aligned with your business needs, right? So like I had one subscription and then I had my business units like finance and HR, and maybe I had a resource group for each of them. And then I went and deployed my things and sprinkled them out there and did that. In today's world, where it is easier to create, operate, manage, and maintain multiple subscriptions, you can really up-level that and think about it at a higher scope. And you can go from treating your resource groups as a unit of management that are aligned with your business needs to treating subscriptions as a unit of management that are aligned with your business needs. And then once you do that, you're in a totally different place. Like it is a different mindset and a different way to think about it. And I tend to find as long as all your subscriptions are in the same tenant, like you talked about having 12 subscriptions across multiple tenancies and kind of the pain that comes along with that, like I totally get that. That's a pain. But as long as I can do things like AZ login once to my tenant and then have access to all the subscriptions at it, like I really don't care if it's in sub A, sub B, sub C, whatever it happens to be. Subscriptions is subscription. I just want to get down to the underlying resource that's available with it there.
Yeah, I agree 100%. That it absolutely was in the early days, and I think this is, to your point, why people are struggling with it. People were doing stuff at the resource group level. It was resource groups for departments, for business units, for applications, for use tagging, use all of that. And I think it's very much transitioned to subscriptions. And if you want to do a SharePoint analogy, it's kind of like the transition we've seen there, where it used to be, let's create a SharePoint site collection and create all the SharePoint sites underneath it. And it has transitioned to now, let's just do site collections for everything. And there's no point in creating subsites. For those of you that are in the Office 365 space and need an analogy to that.
Yeah.
But
I mean, again, you go back to like even the SharePoint analogy. In SharePoint, you never create just a single site collection.
No.
You are going to end up with multiple ones. And I go back to like that CAF thing. Like if you go into the docs, it just keeps driving you this way. It's saying like, hey, here's recommendations, and they're not even recommendations. Like we're in like patterns and practices. These are things that have been proven out across multiple customers over time, and this is the way like stuff is managed at scale. Like these are like direct learnings from Microsoft having to do itself, their major customers, even their internal services, right? If you think about like, Azure SQL. Azure SQL is an Azure service that is built on top of Azure as well. Azure Storage is a service built like we're all built on top of Azure, and so you have to get into that mental model and that mindset. So like even if you go to the create your first subscription guidance in the CAF, it's not create your first subscription, it's create your first 2 subscriptions. Here's how to create your production and your non-prod subscription at the same time. Like just go ahead and get this done from the start. And then you got to figure out the next friction points. Like, how do you deploy things? How do you move things around? How do you secure them? And there's tons of great prescriptive, like really good, really prescriptive guidance out there for that with things like landing zones. You mentioned network topologies. Like, hey, there's a ton of guidance out there for thinking about, like, do I do hub and spoke? Do I need connectivity back to my WAN? Do I do virtual WAN? How do I think about IP addressing across multiple subscriptions, multiple VNets, multiple subnets, all those kinds of things? How do I think about security? Like, it all just starts to kind of tie back together once you have that initial mental model in your head.
Yeah, and Pirate is asking in the chat too, like, do you think it's purely a conceptual thing? And I'm assuming you're meaning like getting over that barrier of having multiple subscriptions and thinking through all those concepts. And I would say 100%, especially from people that have been doing Azure for a long time and been listening to Microsoft talk about it for a long time, is that it's, yeah, like you said, it's a step upwards in the architecture. That's, as it's grown, as people have used Azure, as we've learned more, as we've architected more, it is absolutely a step upwards in the architecture and thinking through how you plan this out. And you even look at like some of the Microsoft exam stuff around architecture and going back to hammering home this multiple subscription thing is Microsoft more and more hammers through, and it came through, like Scott said, the landing zones, through the cloud architecture framework, all of that is, this is one of those things that anybody that's standing up Azure now or looking at moving forward with Azure needs to understand these concepts and really put thought and planning into this ahead of time. I do feel for companies that maybe have been on the same Azure subscription for 8-9 years. They got on Azure when it first came out, when it absolutely was do everything in one subscription. They put it all out in resource groups, and now they're running into challenges. It is not easy to go take one subscription and break it up into a whole bunch of different things, because you can't just pick up resources or pick up networks and move them from one subscription to another subscription. There is absolutely some rebuilding that is involved in that.
I think it's getting better. Like the number of things that kind of tend to cause friction or pain, like that list, like if you thought like, hey, that's my shopping list of stuff I got to go grab off the shelf, like it's getting smaller and smaller by the day. So that could be things like, honestly, moving resources between subscriptions these days isn't really that bad. Where it becomes painful is typically when you're trying to move resources between subscriptions that are in different tenants, like back to that, wrap your head around like how your tenant model is going to tie into your subscription. Just about everything else, like, not too bad. The other big pain point with resource stuff is just being able to like move your resources between regions. Like sometimes companies choose to go down that path. It's a little orthogonal, but that's another consideration for you. And that's where stuff like Resource Mover comes into play and keeps you kind of where you need to be. Networking is a sticky one. The thing that I see, and I'd be curious, Ben, like what you see with your customers, is I still run into folks who are thinking about networking and VNetting as really little itty bitty VNets, like /24s versus /16 kinds of things. So they're running out there with like 254 IPs for 250 IPs because of all the reservation, like for this thing, and then they're running for 250 for this thing and for this thing, and then they're trying to tie it all together, and they're trying to figure out how to get a firewall in there and get a subnet for their Bastion thing, and they're like, I just don't have enough and I can't figure it out, and now it's going to overlap with this other thing. It's like, all right, so we got to take a step back. We need to maybe plan things a little bit. Like I think like a lot of this stuff, like it is super helpful to go back to the prescriptive guidance. Like I know not everybody learns from documentation, Like, I get it. Like, I am sympathetic to that. You're not always going to find a video for this stuff, and you're going to have to go read some things, though, just to move them forward. And if you find the Microsoft documentation a little squirrely, like it's just like obtuse to you, I get it, but you still gotta like lean in and go down that way. Maybe there's some YouTube videos or some Pluralsight things, but I think like the definitive resource for this stuff is going to be the Microsoft Docs. Like once you start to get into it and get hands-on with it, I think it helps a lot too.
Yeah, I do see a lot of still those smaller networks, like you said. I did just post a link to in the chat that gives you some guidance around moving networks, because like people are asking in the chat, networks is probably the biggest one, especially if you have peerings. Like you're going to have some downtime, because at least if you're moving a VNet with peerings, you need to remove the peerings, then you can move it, then you can re-enable the peerings. But thinking about overlapping address spaces and networking is, I would say, by and large, probably the stickiest part of moving resources. VPN gateways are another one. If you do have VPN gateways, hopefully you don't have too many of those, depending on how everything is configured. But yeah, it's interesting.
I get it. It's hard. Change is hard. Like I struggle with that stuff all the time. But I think a lot of like I know it sounds harsh, and I don't want it to be a harsh thing. I want it to be a realistic thing. Like if you're looking at this and you're going like, wow, that's a lot of friction. Like I get it. But there is tangible ROI there for you, should you choose to go in another direction, right? And yep. I'll take like let's circle back around to Defender for Cloud customer, right? Like they want to be able to enable this and restrict it to a set of resources. Like with the current billing model for Defender for Cloud, like the reality is like you're going to need multiple subscriptions to make that happen, and some of that friction comes in if you don't already have multiple subscriptions. Like you don't have that mental model. So now you got to go step back and do what for some people was foundational work, but for you could not be. Like it's you circling back around to it and having to rethink things, and then maybe that has a knock-on effect. But if you had already had you already had 2 subscriptions, or maybe 3, like you had like prod, non-prod, and your sandbox, or like your dev, like your real like dev playbox test area, like spinning up another one of those should be pretty common at some point, and you'll just kind of get yourself to where you need to be.
Absolutely. So I don't know that I have anything else on that topic. I think we covered it pretty well. Other than to summarize, go create more subscriptions than you think you need.
Yes, there is always that piece. Like it helps to have at least 2 when you're starting out.
Yep. All right. Well, thanks, Scott. That was an interesting discussion. Always good to talk about structure. I know we have some videos too out there that I think we talked about management groups a little bit. That was in the To the Cloud membership
I got to get you
stuff.
to post those videos.
I need to go put
we
those,
do have a video where we did management groups, created them, kind of talked about some of the nuance of putting that hierarchy together, moving things around in management groups, all that stuff. I gotta get my editor to post them.
Something to do this weekend. I can go edit that video and get it posted for everybody so they can watch where we were playing around with management groups. Awesome. Well, thanks, Scott. I think we'll wrap it up. Go enjoy your weekend. Try not to melt. It is way
I'm
too
gonna
hot.
go sweat it out. I apologize if anybody heard my AC running at 1,000,000%, or my fan that's spinning above me at 1,000,000 miles an hour. But it is currently, what is it? Feels like it's currently 113 as the sun just streams in behind me and hits me more. No, go away.
Yeah.
It's hot outside. Yeah, I'm gonna sit here and have my iced tea and.
My kids went out to the pool today and lasted like 45 minutes. They're like, it's too hot out. The pool is like 88 degrees. You said the same thing. It feels like 115 or whatever. And
yeah, my dogs go outside and I know it's hot when they don't even want to like play with a ball or do anything. They just go outside, they do whatever they need to do, and they turn right back around and come in. I don't even have to say like, hey, come inside. Like normally I have to like go out and herd them, and nope, they're all ready for AC. So
you know what that means, Scott? You should have ice cream for dinner tonight. We used to do that when it was too hot. When I lived in Michigan. In Florida, it's too hot too often to do that. But every once in a while.
I had ice cream for lunch.
Oh.
Like I had a pint of Ben and Jerry's for lunch. So yeah, I don't know if I should watch my figure going in the wrong direction like that.
Well, just get on the treadmill for a little bit now. That's if you eat ice cream while you're on the treadmill, that's okay, right?
Absolutely. Like everything I know about exercise, I learned from Peggy Bundy, right? Like give me a bonbon and a couch and I'm all good.
Perfect. All right. So now we really will wrap it up. Go enjoy your weekend, enjoy your ice cream, and we will talk to you next week.
All right. Thanks, Ben.